The Supreme Court ducks another felon in possession ban case, plus a major gun company weighs in on efforts to reform the NRA. All this and more on the news update.
No, the devil's got no hold on me.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the news update. I'm contributing writer Jake Fogleman, joined as always by Reload founder Stephen Katowski. TheReload.com, of course, is where you can head on over today to sign up for our free weekly newsletter. It'll keep you up to date on all things happening in the world of gun politics and policy. This week's episode is also brought to you in part by The Dispatch, but more on that at the end of the show. This week, we're actually recording a little bit early, so Thursday as of recording this, because you, Stephen, are going to do a range day with the National Journalism Center.
Yes, so we're bringing this to you a day earlier than normal, and that's because tomorrow I will be out at the range with the National Journalism Center interns and doing a little gun policy reporting class with them, and then actually taking them onto the range to get a little bit of firearms training. I'm a NRA certified instructor for basic pistol, nothing too fancy, but I can teach people how to shoot a gun, in addition to teaching these up-and-coming journalists how to report on firearms, or at least some of the best practices. So that's what I'll be doing tomorrow when we would normally be filming this. So we wanted to make sure we got an episode out to you guys anyway in advance of that. But I'm really looking forward to it. It's always a really good time. It's just these I guess this is the fall or spring, winter. I don't know, spring semester, right? It's been a long time since I've been in college, but this would be spring semester, even though it's not spring yet, obviously. But
right.
So they're a little bit. Usually the class sizes are a little smaller for this first one, and then the second part of we do 2 of these a year, and they're for different semesters. And the fall semester, I guess, is usually a little more popular. Or has a lot more of interns, but these NJC interns, they go out and they do internships at publications in the DC area, whether they're conservative or down the middle or liberal or what have you. They go out and get some real world experience reporting. And so, we decided a couple of years back, we actually had the head of the program, National Journalism Center, on the show. I think it was last year around the time that we did this. And, we just thought that this would be a good practical exercise for some of these reporters who may end up covering gun issues in their day-to-day careers. And we wanted to make sure that they had some basic knowledge, which is something that is lacking oftentimes in our media coverage of firearms, as anyone who listens to the show is probably well aware of. And so, I put together a little curriculum on that, and it's, it's obviously not a super in-depth thing, but it is something that can get them up to speed on some of the common issues that we run into, some of the common debates that at the national level on gun policy, and what the different points of view are, and then actually have them handle and fire guns so they can have some experience with that as well, understanding how they work. They're not required, they're not forced to do the gun handling part if they're not able, but most, the vast majority of them do that. And it's, I think, just good training. I mean, I've done that with a lot of reporters as well who are, career reporters at major outlets. But this is, the formal class that I do. And I think it's a big benefit for these students. So I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, you have to give us an update on how it goes on next week's episode. But getting into some of our stories this week, one of the big ones came to us from the Supreme Court. Unfortunately for gun rights advocacy listeners, it wasn't the big news that I think many of them were hoping for in terms of them taking up another Second Amendment case. They actually relisted the big Maryland assault weapon ban case and the Rhode Island quote unquote large capacity magazine case. So they're still kicking that can down the road to consider further.
Before we get to what the main story here, I think it's worth just remarking on that just a touch, because it's like it's really not clear what they're going to do with that. You would think that this is all speculation, tea leaf reading, right? As I always want to warn people on that front, because we don't know. You just don't know what the Supreme Court is doing at any given time with this kind of stuff until they do it. But relisting these cases over and over again, are they going to just deny them? And maybe they're waiting for a dissent of the denial from somebody like Thomas or Kavanaugh or some of the people who have dissented from some of these denials in the past. How long does it take to write a dissent to a denial, right? I don't know, but maybe there has been a history of carrying these higher profile cases over and over and over again. Right. They did that with Dobbs, right?
I think that was relisted like 12 to 13 times before it was granted. So
I don't know. It's one of those things where maybe that's a sign in and of itself that they're relisting these, but maybe not. That's the hard thing with this court. You would think if there's a denial and they're just waiting for somebody to finish writing their dissent, it wouldn't take so long to do that. But you just never know with the Supreme Court. But to me, it sort of leans more towards they are going to take these at some point, but they just don't want to do it right now.
Right. And still wait and see until they do make that choice.
Yeah.
But what they did decide to do is another thing that's probably familiar to folks that have been following the court lately. And that was they issued a GVR, a grant, vacate, and remand of a case. And in this case, it was dealing with the felon in possession ban. They sent it down in light of Rahimi, which is what they've been doing pretty consistently with a lot of Second Amendment cases that have come before the court. But this one is interesting because for the first time, they issued a GVR in a case that was already decided when Rahimi existed. So that's a new twist on this trend.
Yeah, a little weird, right? Hey, reconsider this in light of Rahimi, even though you already did that. Like you did that the first time around. So I don't know. Maybe that says something too. Like, obviously they didn't write out, hey, we didn't like how you interpreted Rahimi, so go do it again. But they did. I mean, it is mentioned in the lower court ruling. So one possibility, and again, only a possibility. There could be a number of things happening here, but one possibility is they just didn't like the way that they interpreted Rahimi. And in this case, they upheld the felon in possession ban for everyone, regardless of whether they committed a violent or nonviolent crime, which is the main issue in a lot of these felon in possession cases now, whether, somebody's crime, the underlying crime is actually serious enough to justify a lifetime prohibition on possessing firearms, whether that comports with the historical tradition from the founding era. And so, maybe this is a signal that they want them to change their view of Rahimi, although it's not exactly clear why Rahimi would invalidate this ruling. There are some things you can guess at, right? Like Rahimi's holding was that Rahimi's temporary firearm ban was justified because there was a court finding that he was actually dangerous. He'd committed a number of violent crimes, or at least was accused of a number of violent crimes. And so those are two aspects not at play necessarily in this lower court ruling, although there's you can tell us a little bit more about the actual details of this case, but there's some dispute over whether this was a violent or nonviolent offense that was involved. I think the court itself the lower court didn't really care one way or the other. They just said felony gun possession ban is fine. It's also a lifetime ban. That's different from Rahimi. But, just because Rahimi, you can draw those conclusions or those implications from Rahimi that, the court is only saying that temporary bans for, judicial findings of dangerousness are acceptable under their framework. It doesn't necessarily mean that there's 5 votes to say all permanent bans are unconstitutional or all nonviolent offenses have to be taken out of the prohibition. It's just in Supreme Court cases, especially when you get a large majority, like in Rahimi 8-1, they're usually just looking for the lowest common denominator that they can all agree on. It doesn't necessarily mean just because there were 8 votes to say in this case the person can be disarmed doesn't mean that they all agree that there would be 5 for something like range. That other prohibitions aren't allowed besides that one. They're just saying this particular prohibition is allowed in this case. And so, you can try to draw conclusions from that or try to make inferences, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get 5 justices that agree with that. I guess is the point I'm making there. And so it's hard to say that Rahimi, what they're trying to get this lower court to do, right?
Yeah, it's difficult, especially because the lower court decision that this petition came from was just a 4-page, very brief, unsigned opinion. It was per curiam, so no individual judge put their name to it. It wasn't even published.
But
and
it's
essentially
unanimous.
The basic holding was that, it was the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals. It was about a Florida man. And they essentially said the 11th Circuit's precedent is that based on language in Heller, that was repeated in Bruin, sort of something we've seen before, where they said, we're not, presumptively lawful bans, like long-standing bans on felons. Therefore, we have no need to go like case by case, felony by felony, and question the ban. So it's presumptively constitutional. And so,
right.
And then they added that language at the end and then Rahimi was decided. Rahimi had nothing to do with the felon in possession ban, and Rahimi didn't say anything about it potentially being, vulnerable to constitutional challenge. So therefore it's upheld. So it
Which
could
is
just
true.
be that, right. It's true. It could just be that the court is saying, hey, you didn't give Rahimi enough serious treatment, or it could just be that you interpreted it wrong. It's difficult to say what the court is looking for. It's just noteworthy that in a case that literally mentions Rahimi at the end of the opinion and says, hey, yeah, we see that Rahimi was decided. We don't think Rahimi does anything to this case. Therefore, it's constitutional. It's just interesting to see them say, do that again.
Exactly. And I think you hit on the other major possibility here, which is just that they want the lower court to do more, to expound more, to develop the case law in this situation more before they weigh in. That, a 4-page opinion is not giving them a lot to work with. And so, and a couple paragraphs on Rahimi, just mentioning it is maybe not what the court thinks of as fully considering their precedent. And that may be what's going on. They just want the lower court to do more, right? Give us more of your reasoning, go through this in more detail. We don't just want, you to check the box. And then also they sure seem to have a tendency of late to want to kick all these cans down the road, right? It could just be that they don't want to deal with it right now. But maybe they will in the future. So, it doesn't hurt to go back from the court's point of view. It doesn't hurt for the lower court to go back and develop this more, because, it gives the Supreme Court more time to come to a more solid understanding of who's in at what place on these issues, so that they can decide on which cases they want to take up and which cases they don't. There's a lot of possibilities with it. I do think that the first possibility is the most interesting, right? That this lower court did consider Rahimi. It didn't consider it very deeply necessarily, but it did consider it, and it came to a conclusion, and maybe the court doesn't agree with that conclusion, and that's why they GVR'd it. That would be the most impactful reason for doing it, because it would give you some insight into, maybe the court isn't happy with the felon in possession ban as it stands today under current federal law. But they don't say that, so we can't know for sure. But we're going to keep watching it. That's
absolutely. And
for sure.
And if they really feel that way, they can always take up a case and tell people literally that they feel that way, which I'm sure both the DOJ and gun rights advocates would appreciate. Although I'm not sure about this current DOJ. That's still an open question as well.
Yeah, I just said we'll see what
have to see.
Current DOJ, where they end up on these things too. We don't know yet.
Another one of our stories this week, you had a piece about an interesting figure in the gun manufacturing space, one of the most prominent manufacturers of particularly AR-15s, so Marty Daniel of Daniel Defense, and him taking sort of a public stand in the ongoing efforts to reform the NRA.
Yeah, and really not even just him, right? Because, I mean, he's the one in the video making the plea, but they put this video out on the Daniel Defense social media pages. So it's coming from the company. And this is a major manufacturer, right? It's not, Ruger or Smith & Wesson are the biggest publicly traded companies, but Daniel Defense has certainly been one of the leading manufacturers, especially like you mentioned, of AR-15s, but also they've gotten into other firearms. More recently, they're making handguns now, and they're kind of an up and coming company over, in the span of decades. Not, they didn't just start up yesterday, but they, compared to these companies have been around since the 1800s. They're relatively new, and they've made a big name for themselves. And they're Marty Daniel, the head of Daniel Defense, or the founder, coming out and getting involved directly with this NRA reform movement is very interesting to see, especially because he, as he outlines in this video, he is somebody who supported the NRA in the past and then stopped supporting him over the corruption allegations against Wayne LaPierre and other leaders of NRA membership that culminated in this 6-year legal ordeal that they've just finished wrapping up, right? And his argument is essentially that the NRA has reached a point now where he feels comfortable getting back involved with it, at the very least, to try and elect this slate of reformers. So we talked about this last year, right? There was this 4 for Reform campaign at the NRA where you had some of the most outspoken internal critics of the NRA, former board members, current board members, who wanted to see a number of transparency reforms put in place and wanted to push out some of the leadership members at the center of the corruption scandal, like Wayne LaPierre. And they won, they got on the board, but it was only 4 of them, right, at that time. But they managed to convince a lot of the board members, probably from how well they did in the elections, to join their point of view, just to agree with them. And then the NRA elected a series of reform candidates for leadership at the annual meeting. And this happened after Wayne LaPierre ended up resigning just ahead of being found liable for mishandling millions of dollars of NRA funds. And so the tide has kind of turned. It started to turn then. And as you've gone through the rest of this trial, the judge in that case, in the New York corruption case, he settled on a position where he denied a lot of the most serious remedies or repercussions that the New York Attorney General, Tisha James, had wanted to institute on the NRA, things like full-on dissolution, shutting it down altogether, or even appointing a government monitor over its finances. And instead, he went the direction of trusting that these reformers are true to their word and that they're going to actually institute a lot of reforms. And then in addition to that, also, imposing by court order a number of things that they had to do, including rooting out some of the remaining Wayne LaPierre, longtime LaPierre allies on the board, like Charles Cotton, not allowing them to serve on certain key committees like the audit committee. And so, now the reformers are certainly ascendant within the organization, and LaPierre and many of his longtime allies are either gone or their power has been reduced. Although still, I went and covered that board meeting last year where they were voting on a proposal to send to the judge, and you had a majority, it seemed like, of board members on the side of these reformers. People like Rocky Marshall and Judge Phil Journey, these people we've had on the show in the past to give their point of view on all this, and who've been key figures in this internal struggle. However, they weren't able to get everything they wanted, like the removal of the Brewer firm, which had long represented the NRA and been charging them a lot of money, hundreds of millions of dollars over the course of this trial. And, they wanted these certain things, and they couldn't actually get them because while they may have had a majority in favor, they didn't have the institutional knowledge or skill to navigate the internal fight during this board meeting. And so, there's still some question as to what direction the NRA is going to end up. But I think with somebody like Marty Daniel, and especially going through Daniel Defense's corporate communications with this, it's a sign that the tide has really turned quite a bit towards these reformers, internally and externally now at the NRA. And I think it's likely they're going to do well. Last time around, they had 4 people on this platform that they ran on. This time they have, I think it's 28.
Yeah, it's more than half of the candidates running. Yeah,
28 of 49. So they've managed to recruit a lot of people. Some of them are, people who were part of this fight for a long time, and even former board members like Frank Tate are back to do this again. And with the backing, increasingly seeing this kind of external backing, it bodes well for that group, for the reformer types. Here's what Marty Daniel said. Here's a quote from him. The National Rifle Association has led the fight to keep and bear arms, but as you know, they simply lost their way, and many people like me took a step back and refused to condone their behavior with our time and resources. The message was heard loud and clear, and now a change is on the way. With former leadership gone and new leaders at the helm, there's a plan to revive the organization and restore trust with NRA members and all gun-owning Americans. So, he certainly is convinced by the reformers' messaging and the progress that they've shown in this attempt. And it'll be interesting to see if that translates to other, your everyday members, right? Because that's where the NRA has really struggled. That was really always the lifeblood of the organization, was the actual membership, that they had such a large dues paying membership. And that's what's hindered them over the last, half decade as they've gone through this, is that they lost a lot of those people, millions, right? From their peak in 2018, they lost, more than 1 million members. I think they were down to, they lost about 2 million members during this time. And because of that, they've lost a lot of revenue as well. And they've had to slash programs, and they've had to sell assets. And they've been, at times, at least these reformers, some of them like Rocky Marshall, have warned that the company, the organization, could legitimately go bankrupt. They went bankrupt as a legal maneuver that didn't work, but they put themselves in a position now where there was certainly a risk that they could go actually financially bankrupt. They couldn't pay their bills anymore. And so if this Marty Daniel video is a sign that other former members are going to come back, then the NRA may well be in for a fresh start. I wrote about this after the ruling, that there's now the potential that the organization could really start to turn things around, that they may have reached their low point as a group. Now, of course, it's going to be a hard slope to climb, because they've dug themselves into a very deep hole with this whole thing. They're still quite large. They're still larger than all the other gun rights groups out there combined, all the other national groups, but they're so much smaller than they used to be, and their influence has really waned in this time. But they have while they got outspent by the gun control groups in this latest election, their candidate won, and they certainly have a chance to enact a number of the things they want to see done, at least through the executive branch, if not through legislation. So, although the earliest signs we've seen are that the administration is not prioritizing this issue, it doesn't mean that there won't be pro-gun moves made. In fact, I think we'll talk about that in a moment here. But how much influence the NRA or any other gun rights groups have at the moment is unclear, I think. And oftentimes you've seen the administration to prioritize other issues over guns, like the appointment of Pam Bondi being one, and not even getting a question about her background supporting different gun control legislation. Or most recently, we reported on the export licensing and how that had been frozen completely and shut down, in addition to every other export, I guess, that exists. Also, all gun exports. Now, we do have some news on that. It's not confirmed yet, but I have heard from my sources that that freeze did end. So I was trying to get confirmation from the Department of Commerce over this, but I believe the freeze has ended. I think it lasted about 2 weeks. We'll see what the negative effects of that may be, because there's going to be a backlog, and if they start to fire, for instance, the employees that work on that backlog, which seems like a realistic possibility, it may still be a problem moving forward. But my understanding is that the freeze on gun license exports has, on processing new ones, has come to an end. That they're processing them again. So, and I think that may have happened like right after we published our story on it. So I don't know if there was any connection there or not, but certainly what I've heard from the same sourcing that told me about the freeze, they're saying that it has stopped. I'm trying to get confirmation. Commerce Department's not necessarily talking about this publicly, but just an update there. But yeah, so to bring it back and end up that NRA story, I think this is just a sign that some of these people who had been resistant to supporting the NRA during the corruption scandal without significant changes made, significant reforms, some of them sure seem to think that those reforms are now in place and they're willing to come back and help rebuild the organization. So, and I think what happens in this election that's coming up, and people can still vote in this, you can even still buy a lifetime membership if you wanted to go and vote in this, if you're inclined to get involved in, like Marty Daniel has again. So I think until March 4th, you can buy a membership and vote in the election. But we'll see what the outcome of that is, how many of these reformer candidates win, what the makeup of the board looks like after that. And, some of these candidates, one of the things they want to do is shrink the size of the board, right? Most nonprofit boards are not 76 people. And that's one of the complaints that you've had from reformers, is that the board is just unwieldy and non-responsive to membership, and easily manipulated, I guess, has been one of the prime complaints. So we'll see where some of these reforms end up. And then also if the NRA starts to see an increase in membership again.
Yep. We'll have to keep everyone up to date. One of the other big stories we had this week that we won't get too into depth on in this episode, because we're going to have more details for you all in the interview podcast, but that has to deal with the news surrounding Kash Patel, who was originally tapped and confirmed as the director of the FBI and was recently announced as the acting director of the ATF as well. So that sort of answers one of the questions that we've had about what is going to happen with leadership atop the ATF, at least for the foreseeable future.
Yeah. Yeah, we're going to have Reason's JD Tusilli on the show again. We've had him on before, but he wrote an interesting piece on this about Patel and some of and also just like making Patel aside, making the FBI director, the acting director of the ATF, send some interesting signals perhaps about what they might try to do with the organization, with these agencies moving forward. There's been a lot of talk about from gun rights activists, at least, on what they want to see happen to the ATF. And some people want to see it abolished and have the responsibilities folded into other agencies like the FBI. So that not everybody wants that. I don't think the industry wants that necessarily. So we'll talk to him about that and try to get some insight on what this might mean. And then also obviously Kash Patel, a lot of gun rights groups are big fans of him, especially Gunners of America. He spoke at their conference last year, but he has a history of controversial statements, talking about going after people who wouldn't lie about the 2020 election, who wouldn't say that it was stolen, going after them criminally or civilly. He's made a lot of comments to that end of sort of retribution and going after his political enemies in media and government. So, him being the head of the FBI and the ATF is obviously something that raises a lot of question. Now, he did walk back some of those things in his confirmation hearing, but I guess it just depends on whether you believe that or not. So anyway, JD, we'll have him on and we'll get his perspective and potential insight into some of these things on the interview podcast this week, which will be out for members on Sunday and Monday for everyone else.
Listeners should check that out. Getting into some stories from outside the Reload this week, we had an interesting sort of completes the cycle we've seen of major newspaper reporting covering some of these new gun owners and uncovered stories. This one came from the Washington Post, and this one was specifically a profile of the rise in trans gun owners who are responding to concerns with the changing political climate, the election of Donald Trump, and some of the discourse around trans rights more generally. And many, at least according to this Washington Post piece, are taking up firearms to defend themselves.
Yeah. And again, interesting to see these major outlets kind of doing the reporting that we've been doing for a while here. Not saying that they're copying us or anything, but it's a good thing, honestly, to see other outlets do this. I wish we'd done this piece ourselves, honestly, before they got to it, but good for them. They and the piece I think is good. And it is interesting because usually in these gun owner pieces, right, you'll get, at least a token passage about why with some sort of talking point about how owning guns is bad for you, essentially, that, you're more likely to, they'll use talking points from a lot of gun control groups about the risks of gun ownership. And you don't see that in these last two ones from the Times or the Post, which is interesting. But because it often comes off as fairly patronizing, honestly, and maybe that's why they're not doing that, because they're profiling groups of people that they like more than perhaps your stereotypical gun owner, if that makes any sense. But it's a very good piece, if I'm being honest. Like I think the piece comes across really well. It just goes out and interviews people who are buying guns for the first time, and because of the view that they have of society becoming more hostile towards them, and the violence that has occurred against some trans people is an understandable motivator for them to want to arm themselves. And some of the rhetoric that exists out there targeted at trans people is very violent, and so it's not necessarily surprising that you might see them want to arm themselves. I think they even had a quote from the NRA that just basically said people of all stripes are, wanting to own firearms as a form of self-protection. And the NRA, to their credit, was not, didn't try to speak out against this. I do, that is one area where you start to wonder if, certainly there's a political movement out there that sees trans people as too mentally ill to perhaps own guns, and that would be a very disturbing, I think, effort to if there were any attempt by the government to restrict ownership of guns to trans people. So, we've seen now that there's an executive order restricting service in the military, basically kicking trans people out of the military. It's not impossible to think this could extend something further than that, but it hasn't yet. There hasn't been any talk of that from the administration, to be very clear. So, but it is one of those things where it's understandable why this group would be concerned for their safety and want to own firearms. And the piece just kind of interviews them and gives their point of view, which I think is good journalism. So that's probably something we should, obviously we've talked to trans gun owners and gun rights activists in the past for pieces, but maybe we should have somebody on the show to give their point of view on all this coming up. Maybe somebody from Blazing Sword, which is one of the gun rights groups that trans people are involved with. So yeah, I think it's a good piece overall, though. Like I said, interesting to see this happening across the two largest newspapers in the country now. We just had one from the New York Times, and now we have one from the Post about these new gun owners in the sort of second Trump term environments, and they're treated pretty sympathetically as compared to maybe some other kinds of gun owners that exist, right?
Yeah, it's definitely a refreshing change in some of the more mainstream sort of legacy reporting on firearms, for sure.
Yeah. I'd like to see more of it for more people, right? Like,
yeah,
I think it's very fair to treat these the people in these stories sympathetically. They have sympathetic stories, but so do lots of other gun owners,
right.
And we don't hear from them very often.
Yeah, no, it's an important point because you do tend to see a discrepancy in who gets treated sympathetically and who doesn't in some of these stories. But getting into a couple other stories from outside the Reload, a little bit of a state update, both from my state and yours. So I linked to a piece here from Cam Edwards over at Bearing Arms, and he just sort of updated his audience about the fact that Colorado's bill to essentially levy a whole bunch of new restrictions on the purchase of ammunition, including raising the minimum age to purchase any ammunition to 21. It cleared the House of Representatives in Colorado, so it's cleared its first chamber. It should go to the Senate, where it looks like, quite frankly, it's on a glide path to passage as well. So another gun control bill on the move. One thing I wanted to mention about this bill is I think I introed our listeners that this bill was being considered a couple weeks back. But one thing I didn't mention that I think is just worth mentioning is that one carve out of this bill, or one provision, specifically goes after those ammunition vending machines. So if our listeners recall, that became, a particular company started putting these in some grocery stores and hardware stores, and it became an immediate moral panic among certain gun control activists and some Democratic politicians who thought this was such an outrage that there would be ammo in vending machines. And there was only one in the entire state of Colorado. One popped up in a rural town in Colorado, and that, I guess, was enough to prompt them to put in the bill that you can't do that anymore, and any ammo sales must be done with the help of a clerk. It can't be automated whatsoever, and that looks like it's going to become law.
Yeah,
here.
That's funny too, because there's, as far as I understand it, we talked about this back when they first started popping up. Those ammo vending machines, while sort of an interesting kind of cool novelty thing, they don't work like normal vending machines, right? You don't just put in money and get ammo out. They like take your picture, they scan your ID, is my understanding of how these things work. And so they're probably doing more in terms of like screening the buyers than, your local Walmart's ammo counter is. So I don't know. It's just, it does strike me as more of a moral panic thing, like you mentioned. And it is funny to see them, legislators try to ban them when there's literally just one in the whole state. So anyway, we'll keep an eye on that, I'm sure.
Absolutely.
What's the latest with this, I guess, semi-auto ban turned permit to purchase law? That's their big ticket item.
It's still only cleared its first chamber. It hasn't had its first House committee hearing just yet. But like I told listeners before, and I think I explained in my piece, sort of breaking down the changes, it'll pass the House easily. The Senate was always going to be the bigger hurdle, and it started in the Senate. And with those amendments, getting it out of there, it's on a glide path to the governor's desk. Yeah. And because he was so influential in getting those permit to purchase concessions, I suppose, I think it's reasonable to expect that he's going to sign it and it's going to become law. Right.
That seems likely. And it's probably more, it's going to be an easier law to defend in court. I don't know if they'll be successful or not, but as we've discussed, like permit to purchase is a different level than an outright ban. But we have seen some permit to purchase laws struck.
That's right.
But it's less clear when you get up to the Supreme Court and its jurisprudence on permitting and guns, how they would handle something like that, because, they have carry and ownership on the same level now after Bruin, as, these core Second Amendment rights. And they say that permitting is acceptable for carry, at least certain kinds of permitting, right? Shall issue permitting, where that's not too cumbersome. So what are they going to say about permitting for purchasing guns? Will they have a distinction there or not? That's what we'll have to see. But yeah, as far as Virginia goes, where I am, we've had a similar to last year. This is one of the reasons we haven't written much on this, but you've seen a slew of gun control bills pass the House and Senate now because they have narrow Democratic majorities in both here in Virginia, and they're awaiting Glenn Youngkin, the Republican governor, action from him. I think everyone expects that he will do what he did last year, which is veto the vast majority of these bills, which, kind of include, there's sort of a wish list of different gun control measures, and from, assault weapons bans to magazine limits, everything else you could think of. He vetoed those last year, and he's likely to veto them again this year. He hasn't responded to requests for comment, but I haven't seen any indication that there's going to be a change. We'll see. We'll probably cover that closer to when he actually decides to sign or veto these things. And honestly, that, from what I understand, doesn't happen until late March or mid to late March, when the deadline comes up for him having to act on some of these bills. So we'll see where that goes. I think it's mostly interesting for looking forward in Virginia, because Virginia, unlike most states, has off-year elections for governor, and they have term limits that only allow you to serve one consecutive term. Like, you can't serve more than one term. You can come back and serve again, but not consecutively. So Youngkin can't run again. I think Youngkin has remained relatively popular in Virginia, but because he can't run again, that always makes the governor's race a bit more interesting, because you're not going to have an incumbent necessarily. You can get a governor come back around after 6 years, but it's and with Virginia being an off year, what you tend to see is the out party doing better than the president's party. And the president is a Republican, Donald Trump. And so Democrats have a leg up, at least from a structural standpoint, and how these things tend to go, and may well win this election. And then also, Virginia has a lot of federal employees, especially in Northern Virginia, and the Trump administration has been firing a lot of those people. And so that is probably not going to bode well for Virginia Republicans, but the election is a while off, so we don't know. But it is very likely, I think, that if Democrats win the governorship here again, they have a trifecta, you will see a number of these bills probably become actual law. Maybe not all of them, though. That is one of the things where it is often easier for somebody to vote for a bill when they know it's not actually going to become law than when they have to answer their constituents for some sort of restriction. Especially in Virginia, had a very significant grassroots backlash to a number of the gun control laws that were passed a few years back when Democrats had control the last time. Although, much like Colorado, which had a similar backlash in the initial magazine ban, many of those bills, while they prevented a number of bills, like an assault weapons ban, from going into place, a lot of the bills that did make it in, like universal background checks and red flag laws and carry restrictions for localities, those are still in place, even though Republicans managed to win the governorship, because they never really managed to get trifecta control in the House and Senate here. So a lot of the things that made it into laws have remained. So,
yeah, it sounds like that's going to be a developing story in Virginia going down the road. Maybe so you won't see it this time around, but certainly in the very near future, depending on how the elections go, it could be another hotbed of gun control politics that we'll be sure to keep everyone on top of going forward.
And then we also had, was it South Dakota?
Oh, yeah, that's right. Speaking of gun politics trends, so South Dakota became the latest state. Yeah. Their governor just signed a bill to essentially, they call it the financial privacy or for gun owners, but what it's really going after is things like the merchant category codes that are being pushed in certain blue states. And I think they're the 19th. Banning them.
Yeah, you can't make a specific merchant. Yeah, you can't use the merchant category codes for gun stores or whatever. which is that's been a common thing you've seen in red states lately, right?
Yeah, I think they become the 19th upon his signature, as opposed to 3 blue states that have required these codes being used, Colorado being one of them, as well as California and New York. So you've certainly seen red states take off the other way, and only a small amount of blue states have gone the other way. So yeah,
and I'm sure that's fun for the credit card company processors. But yeah, so that's one of the state level trends that we've definitely seen the last couple of years since this fight started, is that a lot of red states have jumped on that trend to get these bans on certain merchant category codes. So South Dakota became the latest. That was our other state gun law that we saw. But yeah, I think that's all we've got for this week, right? Again, tune in for more on Kash Patel as the acting director of the ATF with JD Tusilli from Recent Magazine. That'll be out on Sunday for members and Monday for everybody else. If you're not a member yet, you should go ahead and buy a membership and support the reporting we do. It's the only way we can do this. We are fully member funded here at The Reload. Independent publication. I own it. There's no big corporate backing or big donor backing. This is 100% member driven organization here at The Reload. And so that's how you can fund us. In fact, this ad we're going to show you is not actually paid for by the Dispatch. We are doing an ad swap where they run an ad for us and we run an ad for them. Speaking of which, let's hand it over to myself for a little more on the Dispatch. All right, folks, it's time to talk a little bit about the Dispatch, doing an ad swap here between the Reload and the Dispatch. And I think that's fitting because if you like what you're getting from the Reload in terms of high quality reporting that focuses on hard news, you'll probably like the Dispatch as well, because get this, they also focus on high quality reporting and hard news. Now, they are a much broader publication than the Reload. We obviously focus on one specific area, whereas the Dispatch has a much larger team and is able to focus on a whole number of other issues, but still primarily in that national politics realm like we do here at the Reload. But they are one of my favorite publications. I am a paying member to the Dispatch, and so clearly, I highly recommend it. I've been a paying member since they were founded, and I've never had reason to rethink that even once. So they are constantly breaking news stories. They are sending you newsletters on whatever frequency you want. They have quite a variety of them over there. But I subscribe, for instance, to the Morning Dispatch, and I get, I think, a very nice summary of what's really going on from a pretty sober perspective. That newsletter is hard news and it's focused on it. And I think it's fantastic, but they also, of course, have some of the best commentators, in my personal opinion, over there as well. It was an outlet founded by Steve Hayes and Jonah Goldberg, 2 guys I've known for a long time. They've been on the Reloads podcast. Kevin Williamson as well has been on our podcast. So you've heard from these guys if you've been a Reload listener for a while here. And, I think you should check out the Dispatch if you haven't already. We have a free trial as well, 30-day free trial for Reload listeners if you want to go over and check out their paid offering, which I think is well worth the money. So I'd encourage you to do that. There's a link in the description of this podcast or on our website if you want to check it out. So head over to the Reload to get that link, or head over to the Dispatch to see what they're all about.